Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Transition Crossroad podcast. It's another session where we get to discuss the nitty-gritties of Africa's energy transition and its multidimensionality. And on today's episode, we are really excited to have a very interesting topic that we've crafted as results to risk to results, rethinking how we finance clean energy access in Africa. And we are really excited, super excited to have with us as our guest someone that has actually been within the sector for a long time, that has extensive experience to speak to this conversation. She's no other person than Anita Otubu. Yeah, the Anita Otubu you'll be hearing about. So basically, she's been within the sector for a long time. She's the experience is it's overwhelming, and that's why I'm really excited about this conversation, because I know that the information we're going to synthesize from this is going to be really valuable to all the critical players within the sector. So Anita Otubu is a sustainable energy expert with a successful track record of achievements really worthy of mention. She's been within the space, especially the energy policies project management space, for over 15 years. She currently serves as the Senior Director of the Sustainable Energy for All, where she leads the Universal Energy Facility. She began her career as a legal officer at the UN Home Office, at the UK Home Office rather, where from there she has transitioned to other influential roles as a member of the advisory power team, the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria, also as a technical assistant legal to the Minister of Power. Over the years, for instance, in 2020, she became the head of the project management unit of the Nigerian Electrification Program, and under the Rural Electrification Agency of Nigeria. Under her leadership, this is really interesting for me. The project attracted over $120 million in private capital that established over 1 million energy connections. In terms of educational qualifications, she's not lacking. Also, she holds a bachelor's of law from Kingston University. She also has a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the University of Law. Then, what is really exciting to read out? She has a renewable energy for executive leadership diploma development program from the Harvard Business School. Then she also has some really amazing advisory. She's also currently a member of different advisory groups, like the United Nations Office for the Special Advisor on African Knowledge Network, Technical Advisory Group of the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, Advisory Board of Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, Joint Technical Advisory Group of the African Development Bank Mini-Grid Market Association, Technical Advisory Group of the United Nations Development Program. She's also an advisory board of the African School of Regulations. So if I keep reading it, you already know that this conversation is really going to be definitely explosive. Anita, thank you for making it to the program, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ogenegari, for inviting me on your podcast. And apologies for those who are listening in who had to listen to all of those, the background in terms of my educational and work experience. But thanks anyway for acknowledging that too at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point that out, so that when we're having a conversation, our listeners can know that the person speaking actually has the wherewithal to speak to the conversation. Diving into the conversation immediately, before we actually look at the technicalities or the nitty-gritties of the conversation, I would actually want you to speak to our listeners about what is currently happening at the Universal Energy Facility, what it's all about, and what you're trying to achieve, so that our listeners can have a background knowledge of where you're coming from.
Thank you. So the results-based finance facility that we lead is called the Universal Energy Facility. So essentially, we provide grant funding based on agreed upon verified milestones towards achieving energy access in the hardest to reach communities. We are multi-donor funded, so we're funded by the likes of Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, Shell Foundation, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, FCDO, the then USAID, Carbon Trust, Good Energies, GIZ, to name a few. Just to show how many philanthropies and sovereigns are interested in achieving universal access to electrification. As you know, there's 600 million plus people without access to electricity in Africa alone. However, it's not the most viable of businesses in terms of deploying decentralized energy access solutions in rural communities. And so we recognize that private sector will require some aid, some support to help them crowd in that finance
Yeah.
to be able to deploy these solutions at scale. So the Universal Energy Facility, we provide grants that covers a subsidized amount of the capital expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
And this oftentimes is seen as deferred equity of the developers, and therefore attracts finance, whether it be equity or debt, because essentially, like I'd mentioned before, it's seen as a way to de-risk the projects. At least the financiers don't have the entire burden, right,
Yeah.
of covering the entire cost and not being sure as to return on their investment within a short time frame. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
form of blended finance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that, yeah, in a nutshell, we're in 6 countries at the moment. We're in Madagascar, uh, Republic of Benin, Zambia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. What else am I missing? Madagascar, Republic of
Yeah.
Benin, Zambia, Nigeria,
Of
Sierra
course.
Leone, DRC
Yeah.
as well. So those are the 6 countries that we're currently operating in, and we hope to expand to other regions, locations, in order to truly, address the challenge that's before us in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the energy deficit or energy access deficit.
Yeah. I didn't think that's really exciting for me because I've always understood that the private investors are usually skeptical because of the risks within the African market, and I think that actually gives a solid build up to the next follow-up questions. I understand that about just 2 to 3% of global funding gets to Africa in terms of clean energy investments because private investors are really skeptical because maybe there's no offtake demand and stuff like that. So as a form of foundation to the conversation, what do you think are the biggest structural barriers currently preventing clean energy financing from scaling across Africa? Maybe taking it from even if maybe like just 5% increase from the current 2%, despite, because I also understand that currently the global funding for clean energy has well overtaking that for investment in fossil fuels. I think about 1 trillion to about $2 trillion. So there is a lot of money in the sector, but ironically, it doesn't go to Africa. So what do you think the structural barriers are?
So firstly, there's an issue with the lack of early stage capital, right? Early stage capital available to developers within Africa. This early stage capital is required to support them with feasibility studies, to support them with developing their business models, business plans, etc. And without this, they're going to be left with a thin pipeline of undeveloped projects. It's important that they're able to, meet the expectations at the application process of climate investors or funders. And so oftentimes, because there's lack of this funding to really go out and gather the data and the information that's needed to put together investment ready projects, this is probably the first barrier. The second barrier is even just awareness, right, of some of the climate investments or finance that's out there. I can't remember, I think Acumen, which is an international investment company, I believe they had about $200 million worth of investments for clean energy or climate related projects rather. However, 6 months after requesting for proposals, no one had submitted applications,
Wow.
right? So just, just getting yourselves out there, going to conferences and networking and conducting desktop research to know what is out there. So a lot of finance out there, but are we tapping in? We're not tapping in because we're not even aware of it. We're not doing the due diligence or research to even know what to even apply for. Another issue is to do with transaction costs. right? It's super expensive to secure finance for these types of renewable energy or climate-related projects in Africa, particularly when you think about the volatility of local currency.
Yeah, true.
Um, fluctuates, inflation, the very fact that, so when we're talking about renewable energy projects, for example, you're securing finance in hard currency, you're purchasing equipment, majority of equipment, again, probably in hard currency, but you're being paid for the power that's being supplied from this infrastructure deployed in local currency.
Yeah,
Which oftentimes isn't pegged at a particular dollar amount, right? Because you can't do that because people's salaries aren't pegged to a particular dollar amount.
true.
Right? And so you end up, facing the risk of, losing funds as a result of this. And I wouldn't say there's so much of a political risk, because I think Africa, particularly countries like Nigeria and Sierra Leone, they've shown significant political will to support investment, to create the enabling environment for climate-related renewable energy projects, just through their efforts to provide relevant regulations, to attract private sector investment and participation, and to also protect their investment as well. You've seen them also crowd in finance, whether it be via the World Bank, African Development Bank, or philanthropies, through financing agreements, and they're providing grant funding as well, to private sector companies. Projects such as the Nigeria Electrification Project, which I previously, and now the DARES program. This is government that's doing this. So I wouldn't say political will is a structural problem. I think that is there. I wouldn't even say regulatory framework is a problem. That probably would have been a problem some years ago.
Yeah, true.
And I know a lot of people, they're just used to saying the same thing on these
true.
concerns. No, the regulations are there. Perhaps maybe where the challenge would be is when it comes to the relevant agencies responsible for for evaluating applications and issuing out the necessary permits and licenses required within a short time frame. So delays in approval processes could also increase transaction costs as well. There are a number of issues. There's also the issue of pipeline scale, right? Of most of these climate investors want to see huge pipelines of projects. You can't come to them with, oh, we want to build one mini grid in one community, right? They want to. They need pipelines of significant number of villages or schools or health facilities for the economics to really work. Right. And then there's also the issue of, and again, this goes probably back to transaction costs. Who are the end users of whatever service is being
provided?
Right? What level of economic activity are they engaged in? What is willingness and ability to even pay? Right? So that issue in terms of return on investment is there, which I'd mentioned before as I spoke to what the Universal Energy Facility seeks to hold. Right? I could go on and on and on. There's also the issue of, our local companies, so African companies owned and led by Africans, right? They are emerging companies, particularly in the climate and renewable energy space, right? So they don't necessarily have, again, huge pipelines of existing projects built and operated, existing portfolio of finance that has been secured. And so, it will take a while for them to, be able to build the portfolio of projects and finance raised in order to instill that investor confidence in them. Right? Here, that, oh, maybe the international company should be responsible for raising finance and owning these projects, but they could always subcontract it out to the local companies. They can go and install the PV panels and the batteries and so on, but let the international guys. And I have no problem with international companies partaking in this space. I actually love it because they usually come with a wealth of experience. They bring the
definitely.
And also the quality and standards that they bring to their projects, for me, always sets a good example for a lot of our local companies to also follow. Don't have that experience, so we don't have substandard types of projects out there that aren't sustainable. But the fact that these companies are very, the new, I'm talking about the local companies, they're new, they may not have the right structure, organizational structure in place. You find some may not even have a CFO in place. Just not having the right, corporate structure can also impact your ability to raise finance.
Definitely.
And so lack of training, technical assistance to support both government, public and private sector entities that want to secure this finance, to help them understand, what is required from an institutional point of view, what is required from a pipeline of, in projects point of view, in terms of how do we ensure that they're investment ready. We need that training. We need that consistent structure in place that we can go to and tap into.
I think this is really important because, like you mentioned, if you check through literature coming from an academic background, you usually find certain points recurring: political will, lack of this, lack of that. But like you rightly mentioned, the system is evolving, and as the system is evolving, new challenges are coming up that we need to identify if we need to scale up. And I think this really gives me a very important point to drive to the next question. You also mentioned that a lot of these companies find it difficult, especially as regards their feasibility study stage, where they don't get the right data, the right desktop research is not done, and it becomes very difficult to get the needed climate finance or the investments. And I think possibly that's where the result-based financing mechanism come in to actually help to help these companies or these entities get to circumvent this challenge. So the thing is, result-based financing, yes, it's a word, but for a lot of persons, they might not even understand what result-based financing is. So for the next question, I would first of all want you to walk us through how result-based financing works, what makes it an effective mechanism, especially within the African context where we are trying to solve the overwhelming challenge of energy access, and particularly as regards to off-grid communities and these consumers that do not have the capacity that do not have large capacities.
Okay, thank you for that question. So in the past, and still very much till today, presently, the way in which projects are being deployed is via EPC contracts, right? And this is where companies go through a competitive procurement process, they enter into an EPC contract, they build out these projects. If there isn't an O&M contract, they will hand over the project upon or after the technical commissioning and sometimes political commissioning of these projects to the entity, the government organization that engaged them, right? That's funding the project. Now, what is known is that governments across the continent, they don't have sufficient funding to truly bridge this gap of 600 million people without access to electricity, right? They don't have sufficient funds to invest to just deploy out these types of projects using EPC contracts. And so RBF programs allow for private sector companies to crowd in that investment that ordinarily governments may be unable to crowd in themselves, right? It also allows for you to use minimum funds to crowd in a lot more funds. So instead of using $10 million to build out 5 projects, you could probably use $10 million to build out 20 projects. Why? Because that 10 million is only going to cover a subsidized cost of the project. And you need to blend it with other types of finance, whether it be equity, debt, and so on. And so you're able to achieve a lot more for your money. So you have cases where governments are investing in results-based finance solutions where they're only required to provide a small grant amount or subsidized or an amount of funds that subsidize the cost of deploying these solutions. But the onus or the responsibility is on the developer to secure the balance of the funds to be able to fully deploy that solution. Another difference with this RBF process is that, unlike with the EPC contracts where the EPC contractor or the developer hands over the technology or the solution deployed to whoever engaged or whoever's funding the program, in this case, the developer is the owner of the project. So the owner of the mini-grid solution, for example, right? And this is another way of ensuring sustainability of these projects.
Definitely. Yeah.
Oftentimes, you have these companies build these projects, they hand over back to government or to one entity or the other. And then there's that blame game when there are issues during the operations and maintenance phase, right? Oh, it's what the other company built. They put in a substandard, so they use substandard equipment and materials and so on. But if you have the company who's building the project, also operating and maintaining, and also being the owner, who also has to rely on the effectiveness of that solution, deploying or providing power to the end users in order to make a return on their own investment, or in order for them to even pay their investors before they even see profit, they're likely to, exactly, and to ensure, and therefore it ensures a lot more, or enables a more sustainable way of doing things, right? Actually, that's not the best way to put it. It enables more sustainable projects, right? Because when they tend to be handed over, maybe 1-2 years they're operated, but there's this lack of ownership or sense of responsibility. There could be a change in management, right? Where the new management comes in and it's like, oh, yes, that power plant was built by the but I think we should invest in wind. Let's leave this. Wind is the new thing.
Yeah.
But here you have private sector companies who depend on, power being consumed and payments being made as a result of the power being consumed in order, to keep the project running and to also, like I said, pay financiers and make a profit at the end of the day. Another benefit of the results-based finance approach is not only is the subsidy expected to crowd in investment to de-risk these projects, it's not just about filling pockets of private sector, but rather helping the end users too. Remember, these are, residents in rural communities, maybe uneducated, lack of access to real finance, engage in minimum economic activity, right? And so you want to be sure that the power is affordable for them. You don't want to bring about something that's going to be burdensome to them, right? And so you bring a solution that's going to change their lives, and it's going to change their lives in a way that, they can manage, they can pay for it. And that adds to the sustainability topic. If they can't pay for it, the project will fail.
For sure.
And the private sector companies will take out their, infrastructure, deploy it, and move it to the next village.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely.
So the subsidies, because it's a grant through the RBF programs, that typically grants, they don't have to be paid back. So you can afford to deduct, some of this cost from the end user. The end user shouldn't be expected to pay back, they shouldn't be expected to pay a premium when we all know that the infrastructure deployed has been subsidized.
Yeah, true.
Using grant funding that doesn't have to be paid back. So that's also another advantage of the RBF. So, one final advantage, because I can go on and on with these advantages. It's also a way of ensuring that projects paid for are actually delivered and fit for purpose. So you'd asked me initially, how does this work? And I think I just went round and started talking about the advantages and so on. So you did actually ask, how do RBFs work?
Yeah.
So typically, organizations running RBF programs would invite private sector companies who are in the business of developing mini grids to apply. We would carry out certain due diligence activities in terms of you're looking at their corporation documents, tax clearance documents, the usual.
Yeah.
To be sure that these are actual, companies that are legally incorporated and so on, right? And that they have the necessary permits, licenses, etc., to operate. Once they meet that criteria, there's the site-specific stage, which is where sites or communities are identified, they're selected, and presented to the program for approval.
Yeah.
And an example of some of the criterion includes whether there's presence of the national grid. If there's no presence of the national grid, that is a good thing, because we don't want to be, having any issues, any conflicts with the local utility or whoever's responsible for that infrastructure that's there. Secondly, it doesn't serve the purpose of achieving energy access. It means they already have access. So that's obviously a major aspect of what we evaluate or look out for. Willingness of the community to have such a
solution.
or solution in their community. We can't just assume that they, and so that willingness is there. We would ask them to oftentimes, or not we, but RBF programs typically ask these developers to enter into some type of exclusive agreement to deploy solutions, because what you also don't want is, where one community has 5 different developers, to develop projects in that same community. So these are some of the examples that will determine whether a community is eligible or not. Also the density of the community too, because it's not all communities that would require a mini grid. You can't go and deploy a mini grid where there's just maybe 5 households.
Yeah, definitely.
Really makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Thereafter, you would get to the contracting phase, and you enter into a grant agreement with the contractor, or with the developer rather. Once all approvals have been received, enter into this grant agreement, and the grant agreement has been signed, developers quickly move into implementation. But before they can implement or construct these mini grids, because it's a results-based finance facility, it means that there are no upfront costs. There's no advance payment, rather, made to these developers. Developers are expected to raise the initial capital, and then purchase the equipment and deploy the equipment before they can even think of applying for any funding. Typically, RBFs will wait until connections are actually achieved before grants are deployed. But in my case, for the 2 RBF programs I've led, my team or teams and I have, restructured those programs to allow for earlier payments to be made. So, for example, the first payment is now made at the point of major equipment arriving at site. Second payment is made after the technical commissioning of the mini grids. And then the final payment is made after 90 days of supply of electricity, or 30 days of supply of electricity, depending on the program. it still falls under the results-based finance type of framework in terms of only made upon tangible results.
Yeah.
But the issue that it resolves is the fact that financiers were not so confident with the fact that payments were being made at such a late process.
Yeah, true.
After 30 days of supply of electricity or 90 days of supply of electricity. So you're talking about procuring equipment, shipping equipment into country, installation, all of that being carried out, the connections being made before you could even, and even then you still have to wait for at least a month before you can claim any grant.
Yeah.
That poses still a risk for them. So quickly we decided to redesign the program or the payment structure to allow for earlier payments, but still under, the results-based
mechanism.
Mechanism. And so, payments are made at these 3 points, or after these 3 milestones have been made. And just to mention that typically RBFs, the organizations that are implementing these RBFs tend not to be the ones verifying the claims that have been made by the developers.
So there's a third party that makes the verification of the predetermined outcomes before the payment. Okay.
So you have an independent verification agent who will verify, right? Who will verify remotely, physically, to be sure of the quality and the standards of the equipment being deployed and installed, and also to ensure that people, in fact, have been connected, right? This is another benefit sort of the RBF programs. It's not just to be sure that infrastructure has been delivered, but the infrastructure is fit for purpose. In terms of what is its purpose? Its purpose is to ensure end users get access to electricity, reliable electricity flow. And so payment is made at that point. And this is also verified by the independent verification agents before payments are made to the developers. Whereas with an EPC approach, which I spoke about earlier, with an EPC approach, advanced payments are being made. The cost of the project and probably profit on top of that is incorporated and paid to the EPC contractor. And, after the project has been technically commissioned, if there's no operations and maintenance contract that follows, they hand over, right?
Yeah.
And that's it. But here, like I said, once these projects have been technically commissioned, they receive even their final payment, the developers will still be on ground operating and maintaining these plants.
Yeah.
They're also the owners. And so this also addresses the sustainability aspect too.
Yeah, I think it really makes a lot of sense because from what you've spoken about, that means the result-based financing is really tailored to address, in quote, the African, certain challenges that affect Africa's energy infrastructure. Because speaking from someone from Nigeria, we get to see a lot of these renewable energy projects or infrastructures in our local communities that get built. Everybody's excited about it, and along the line, it gets abandoned, and it just becomes a white elephant project nobody's using. So if we're able to, if this solution is really timely, and I think it's really going to have a lot of impact. But then again, it brings to the next question. From what you've pointed out, it's a very exciting solution. But then again, talking about working with the developers, the money is not on ground. Some of these developers might find it difficult to get funding, the initial funding to start up the project before the funding from the RBA comes in. So definitely, I believe there are going to be challenges. So the next question is, what do you think the challenges are that might, in quotes, impact the scaling up of the RBF? That's one. Then also, I also want you to speak to the real life evidences. Obviously, the solution is good, but are there communities now that the RBF mechanism has actually made impacts? Maybe number of infrastructure delivered, homes connected to grid. What are the results on ground that can actually encourage other critical stakeholders to be like, yeah, this is a good solution. Let's tap into it.
So if I understood your question clearly, it's what are the challenges impacting RBFs, and what have been the achievements of RBFs, or the impact from this type of solution or approach? Okay, I'll start off with the impact. Let's start from a positive standpoint.
Okay.
So the Nigeria Electrification Project, for example, which I previously headed, as at the time I left, so they've achieved a significant increase to what I achieved at the point I left. But at the time I left, through this RBF mechanism, we were able to achieve 1 million connections, as in 1 million households were connected, impacting 5 million people. So 5 million people who didn't have access to electricity, or had access to very poor, unreliable electricity, now had access to reliable, clean, and affordable electricity, right? And then with the Universal Energy Facility that I currently lead, we've been able to impact 60,000 people. Yes, it's not as high as that of the Nigeria Electrification Project. The funding is completely different. Completely different. And we have a much smaller pool of funds for the UEF. But with that being said, we're really happy with the fact that we've been able to impact over 60,000 people with over 13,000 connections in a number of countries, and we're still counting. But that will take me to the challenges. Access to philanthropical capital. In order to be able to provide sufficient support or sufficient funding to see significant numbers in those being connected and impacted. So I mentioned that 5 million people under the Nigeria Electrification Project now have access to electricity. And it's a lot more than this number, by the way. I can only speak to when I was there. This war. And this was because the Nigerian government secured a loan facility from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, of a significant number of, let me just say the amount, 550 million US dollars. And this wasn't just for the IBF program, by the way, it was also for, powering healthcare, what they call the COVID-19 program, energizing education program, where they powered facilities and others. But a good portion of that fund was used via an IBF approach to deploy these decentralized and interconnected solutions to get power to the people. So we were able to see significant numbers because the grant funding that was made available was also significant. So you will crowd in significant private sector finance, and therefore, achieve more impact. But with RBFs that are not backed by, or that are not made up of loans, from IFIs to governments, that are made up of philanthropic capital or sovereigns. These are grant funding. It's the pool of funding oftentimes is a lot smaller, and you could understand why, right? To use their funding to cut across a number of sectors, a number of programs. They can't just give all of their money to you or to your
definitely. Definitely, for sure.
But it means that because the pool is so small, the number of developers and projects that you can support it's a lot less, right? And therefore it's not as high. So the challenge is being able to crowd in, the grant funding. Now, with that being said, do I feel as though philanthropic organizations and sovereigns and the high net worth individuals, etc., should be responsible, completely for bridging the access gap, bringing all the grant funding,
No.
address to support in addressing, the access to finance issues. No, I don't. I think that would probably be a bit unfair. There's so many other sectors that would need, such concessional finance as well, or grant funding as well. What I do feel that it should be used for is, to test out new solutions, new innovations, new business models, right? To secure buy-in from governments, right? Take it to the next level. So for me, the Universal Energy Facility, it's to establish markets. So to go into countries where probably there isn't a mini grid market, in terms of there not being mini grid developers operating within that country, and finance available for such projects in that country. It's an opportunity to, especially where there's a regulation in place, to attract private sector participation and investment, which helps. It's the ability for us to come in and say, this is what can happen with a bit of grant funding to support private sector who are in this business, right? And then when they're able to deploy these solutions, and oftentimes, or in the past, some governments have been a bit skeptical. We should take out loans. Are you telling us to take out a loan to then give it to private sector as free money, and you don't have to pay? It's a difficult concept to comprehend, and you can't blame them, right? Because the funds that they have to pay back, right, to the IFIs. However, when you're able to come in with philanthropic capital or concessional finance from sovereigns or whoever, you're able to come in with these funds, you're able to demonstrate how that small pool of funds can crowd in private sector capital.
Investment here.
By, a good number of projects, and you're seeing that it's working, you're seeing that it's the viable projects and the sustainable projects, and the objectives are being achieved. Why would they not want to scale that solution up?
Yeah.
And that's where they now have the opportunity to either use funding from their local national budgets, if they have that type of funding available, or they partner with the likes of African Development Bank, World Bank, or other development partners who may have that type of the EU delegation to that particular country, to provide significant funds to truly scale up these solutions, because we've been able to demonstrate with philanthropic capital, that these projects are actually great solutions and impactful solutions.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Definitely, like you mentioned, it's difficult to comprehend. That's why I actually wanted you to take time to explain it, because getting money and giving it to someone and don't expecting the person to pay definitely doesn't make business sense. But the idea that it's more like stimulating the sector so that private investment can come in, I think it makes the RBF really stands out. And in the course of the conversation, you've always mentioned blended finance, where we talk about concessional funds coming in. But I also understand that over time, I think within the last 10 years, funding from development finance organization has dropped significantly globally. I saw this report recently published, I think, by the EIA, where it was pointed out that as of 2024, the global funding from, I think, public and development finance institution has dropped to about $20 billion. That's almost 1/3 of it lost within the last 10 years. So that means it points out the availability of blended finance becomes quite dicey. So it's more like a build up to the next question I want to ask. So in your thoughts, how can blended finance actually help mobilize private sector investment, especially in clean energy in Africa, considering these challenges that I just mentioned? And can you also share practical examples of maybe where the solutions you think you want to highlight has worked? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? I guess I was muted. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Blended finance is essentially what I've just been speaking about in terms of what RBFs are all about.
Mm-hmm.
It's blending grants with equity or with debt or with forgivable loans, different types of instruments, financial instruments, to sort of slice and dice the risk amongst a number of investors, right? And that ultimately, hopefully, should be more attractive, for investors, knowing that they're not taking it all up themselves. As I'd mentioned, these projects ordinarily aren't the most viable. They don't appear, at least, as the most viable of projects. And so this is how the blended approach, attracts the investors, because they're not taking on the entire risks, whether it be political risks, whether it be currency risks, they're not, or even the ability for the communities to pay, all of the various risks that comes with these types of projects. It's being sort of split across board. And so there are a number of instruments. You have, first loss capital. I've mentioned forgivable loans. It's what everybody's now calling innovative financing. But ultimately, it's just really, different types of finance, typically from different financiers coming together, bringing the funds together and sharing the risks, right? And they also benefit from, the success of these projects too.
Yeah. So finally, there is, like you've also, like you just like you mentioned about the blended finance, like you mentioned, is different stakeholders coming together to pool resources together, which makes it quote the word blended finance. So that means different stakeholders are working together: governments, development finance organizations, private capital, donor committee. So if we are to scale this up, the reason I'm asking this question is because Africa has this mission 300, where we're supposed to have 300 million persons connected by 2030, which is really close by. It's just how many years from now. So if we are to scale up RBF as a solution to significantly contribute to achieving mission 300, what coordinated steps do you think should be taken? Because I'm really particular about this question, because I understand that I think Africa needs about $20-something billion worth of investment per year to achieve its energy access goals, which is really, really ambitious. ROBF is one of the solutions. So what coordinated steps do you think can be taken by the government? So maybe if government persons are listening to it, these stakeholders are, what can they do to significantly scale up the solution across Africa?
Okay. If I could just quickly add to my last answer to your question in terms of types of finance. You also have equipment finance, you have construction finance. Equipment finance, sometimes it's where a financier can take on the responsibility of even bulk procurement of equipment on your behalf and on the behalf of other developers, where they will procure and bring in the equipment, particularly if they're working with a number of developers under the same program, right? So they'll bring, procure the equipment, deploy to that particular country, and ultimately this also, it not only saves time, it also reduces the cost as well, because when you're buying in bulk, ordinarily it drops the price.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
As well. And so this type of finance is also oftentimes blended with RBF grant funding as well. And that's, as I've mentioned, first loss capital, early stage capital in terms of preparatory type finance, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. And now going to your actual, to your current question. First of all, maybe I should just explain what Mission 300 is all about. This is where the World Bank, the African Development Bank, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, Sustainable Energy for All, as well as the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, have come together to develop a plan to achieve electrification for 300 million Africans by 2030. Now, that is half of the population that doesn't have access to electricity today.
Currently.
And Sustainable Development Goal 7 actually required for us to achieve universal access. So that's everybody having access by 2030. So we're definitely off track. And these organizations had quickly recognized that we're off track in terms of being able to achieve this target. And so decided to put more realistic and still this realistic, but still ambitious, right?
Really
goals
ambitious.
For that half of the population. And I think it's admirable, but at least half of this population is connected by 2030. So being a lot more coordinated with its efforts, putting together different programs that would address the energy access crisis and challenges, and to also, really attract all types of capital that will be required to deploy these solutions at scale and within the shortest of timeframes. So this is not to say none of these entities were doing this before in terms of deploying solutions to bridge the energy access gap, but everyone was somewhat partially working in, I don't want to use the word silos, because there was definitely some level of collaboration. But this is a stronger effort. To really bring in technical and financial support, right, to address this challenge before us. Now, what can governments do to support this drive or this goal set by these entities that I'd mentioned? Number one, to ensure that the right legal regulatory framework is in place that would support private sector investment and participation in this space, to ensure that private sector investment is protected, and not that when a new government comes in, maybe a project has been deployed and something happens, maybe utility extends the main grid to that community and decides to just, not destroy, but take over, the management, I guess, of supply of electricity to that particular community, utilizing its own infrastructure or whatever. What is it I was saying? Mind me again, Gary. What was I saying?
You were the government. If there's a change in government and
So apologies. Thank God you could edit this. So as I was saying, you want to be sure that the right legal framework, laws, regulations are in place that will protect your investment.
Yeah, definitely.
Government is in power, administration is in power at that time, or in the next 5 years or 10 years. So governments have that responsibility if they truly want to partake in Mission 300. Or even if they're not part of Mission 300, but they seek to achieve universal access to electricity in their country, and they know they don't have sufficient financial and technical capacity. This is one of the major roles that they have to play. Secondly, I would say they would have to play a role in providing data. Yes, there will be a lot of local participation. We hope that there will be lots of local participation. There will also be international participation. And to be fair, even with the local participation, they may not necessarily have access to data within their own country, right? In terms of knowing exactly where these projects are. Where are these communities that don't have electricity?
Yeah.
Some granular data carried out by some type of ground truthing exercise, to even identify the types of economic activities going on, right? So I guess from a geospatial mapping point of view, you're able to see or count maybe the number of households, right? And the proximity of them from one another and so on, to determine whether, it's a mini grid solution is best suited for that community. But even having some, real granular data going into these communities and understanding how many schools, how many health facilities, what type of economic activity are they engaged in? What's the road infrastructure like? To be able to deliver, to be able to for your own transportation and transportation of your equipment and goods to deploy these solutions. If governments have this data readily available, this will save time and also attract developers and financiers, because it helps private sector make these informed decisions as to whether to partake or not, or to invest or not. And you have technologies for this, like independent energy planning toolkits that can help you gather this type of data. We support governments through our IEP department within Sustainable Energy for All. It also helps to have an energy transition plan too, which is also another service that Sustainable Energy for All provides to governments, where we co-develop these energy transition plans, identifying, what the challenges are, what the issues are, and the solutions, and also an investment plan too, how much finance is required. So when you even have this, you have it clear from private sector point of view, you have a clear understanding as to what the government even wants for its own country, which you can now tap into. Because what you don't want to do is to get involved in a type of business that doesn't align with the plan or strategy of the government of that.
Definitely.
That's also another risk that you will face if it's not aligned in terms of the sustainability of your projects, right? So I'd mentioned regulatory framework, supporting with that, supporting with data, supporting with finance. We know that most of them don't have the finance available, but if they do have access to finance from, the World Bank, from the African Development Bank, from the EU, and also development partners and philanthropies, if they do have that type of network, to be able to support private sector companies, like I mentioned, via RBF programs, blended finance approaches, to crowd in the investment to build out these projects towards, bridging the energy access gap within their countries. So I'd mentioned one, ultimately providing the enabling environment through legal framework, policies, regulations, laws in place. Secondly, data, knowing where these projects are, having some granular data to support private sector in making informed decisions, and also driving down the cost as well for private sector, so they don't have to, conduct as much of this type of
desktop research of some sort.
Exactly. And then I had mentioned, availability of finance as well. Finance. They also have a role to play there too. I would say these are three of the major things they can do. Probably a fourth example, perhaps, is to use their own. No, actually, I think this is a good example. The fourth example is to use some of their own money, so not borrowed funds, but using their own money, right, to build out some pilot projects to also demonstrate how serious they are. Governments just borrowing money or expecting free capital to come in, to build projects. Sometimes they may not be taken so seriously, but when these entity or organizations are seeing that government is willing to use its own funds to deploy some of these renewable energy projects, right? So, for example, with the Rural Electrification Agency, before phase 2 and phase 3 were funded by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, the Rural Electrification Agency, which is part of government, secured finance from the national budget to build captive solar hybrid power plants for federal universities. So this was a program to the head, the Energizing Education Program. So from the national budget, you go through the entire, it was an EPC approach in this case, not an RBF approach, but the government used its own funds to provide reliable power supply to about 7 universities at the time under phase 1. It was supposed to be 9, but eventually, in terms of available funds, government was able to cover 7, which is still a great achievement. Where they now have access to reliable, clean power supply using its own funds. Now, with IFIs like the World Bank, FDB, seeing that commitment made by government to truly show that, the government, the country wants this for itself.
Yeah.
This builds confidence and momentum to step to support and scale up these solutions using different types of capital that's out there.
I totally agree, because we've also seen maybe some of the African countries where some of the governments get laid back. So I think this conversation is really important because the governments really have to step up. Because stepping up already shows, like you mentioned, we are serious about this. It becomes easy for the private investors to know that this is the direction that the government is going.
Yeah.
And I think if all the African governments really sit up and, like you said, take these steps, I think achieving Mission 300 will be really feasible. While although it's quite ambitious now, but I am of the opinion that it's really possible. Yeah, so I really want to thank you for this conversation. It's been really amazing. The information is quite new. It's quite different from what we usually find in literature, where you get to see the same points repeated 2015, 2010. Yeah, I think it's really important. I think that's the essence of this conversation. So thank you, Anita, for taking your time to be on this podcast. We really appreciate it, and I really want to say thank you for for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ogenegari, for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It's certainly a sector that I'm passionate about. And so, yeah, really, really enjoyed this podcast.
Yeah, so thank you. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the podcast. We hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you.